Good morning. Let's turn off this annoying sound. Hello, everyone. We'll give everybody a minute to get settled. This is unfortunate. Sorry, let me do this. So I'm on a different screen today, so it's not as usual. All right. So let's get started. I'll be again asking some polling questions at the end. So, the last couple of minutes of class, and I'll make sure we have enough time to get to them. All right, so the lecture today is about basically the relationship between climate and civilizations, which I always thought was a fascinating topic. Some of you have already started on discussion 3. Discussion 2 is in the process of being graded. I graded my lot last night. I'll talk more about this next week because we'll be talking more about this hiatus or lack thereof. But for those of you who've already done the reading for discussion 3, you are aware that there are examples of civilizations that got deeply affected by climate. And so what I want to talk about today is this. So, sorry, let me quickly fix this thing. There we go. So let me share my screen. Oh, I think I have to share once again the whole thing so that the polls can work. Okay. So do you guys see the screen? Yes? All right. So some of you may or may not have read this book. It's from Jared Diamond, a colleague from UCLA, a biogeographer, as it turns out, who he's a polymath, somebody who's interested in lots of things. And he wrote this book called Collapse, How Societies Choose to Fail or Succeed, which I think has some interesting material in the context of our class. Not all of it, of course, because the first thing I'll say about this is that he derives a 5-point framework for civilization collapse. Basically, what he does in the book is go over a number of examples that have been abundantly documented from all over the world, really, about societies that collapsed in one way or another. And what he did is try to find similarities and differences between them. And he basically boiled it down to these 5 points. The first one is that the first way that a society can work towards its own collapse is damaging its environment. So given the context of this class, it won't necessarily surprise you that that's one of the points. But specifically, they're talking about deforestation or soil erosion. So long before there was any kind of industrial activity, humans, as it turns out, already had the ability to exhaust some of their natural resources, including the soil or forests. And that, of course, led to some very unpleasant situations for them. The second one is, not surprisingly, climate change. Specifically, the types of climate change that appear to have been an issue for past civilizations, at least the ones I'll be talking about today, was either that it got too cold or too dry, right? Drought particularly seems to be a civilization wrecking ball. So we don't have a lot of examples in recorded human history of societies collapsing because it got too hot. But that doesn't mean, of course, that we're not vulnerable to that. It's just that in the relatively short time span of human civilizations, we haven't encountered that problem from natural causes. Third, there's the presence of hostile neighbors. Even in today's world, you know that not every nation state or neighboring tribe is necessarily friendly. So the ability to contain or not contain hostile neighbors was key. Perhaps the history of the Roman Empire comes to mind for this. Then there's the other aspect, is having friendly trade partners that you depend on. And they can either quit being friendly or they can quit trading for a variety of reasons, perhaps because they have their own turmoil or demand for your products is no longer interesting to them. And so that's the fourth part in that 5-point framework. And the final one, and the most important one, the one that appears to be always highly significant, is how a society chooses to respond to its problems. So if you remember one thing from this lecture, it's not that climate change is always involved in civilizational collapse, even though the 3 examples that I'll be talking about today were examples where climate change was involved. But once again, the book analyzes more than a dozen examples, probably more, and climate change is by no means the main factor there. The latter point, the society's response to problem, is always highly significant. So confronted with a problem, how do we choose to react? Do we choose to basically bury our heads in the sand, or do we choose to tackle the problems head on? That's always significant. So that's the main takeaway. If you get that, you're already halfway through the quiz. All right, so I want to consider 3 examples today. The Akkadian Empire, the Greenland Norse, and the Anasazi Indians, or ancient Puebloans. And I want to point out that there are many more. For instance, there is some evidence that natural forms of climate change had an impact on Mayan civilizations. Here you see some of the very impressive temples from Palenque in Mexico. So there's a lot of fascinating questions about why the Mayans thrived for so long, and then basically why did their civilization collapse when it did. I'm not an archaeologist. I'm not aware of the latest findings on the issue. There are certainly some people who think climate change had something to do with it, but it's also clear it's not the whole story. So I'm going to focus on 3 cases where the responsibility of climate change in the demise seems to be extremely clear. And the first one is the one of the Akkadian Empire. So this is one that is relevant for all sorts of reasons, particularly because it flourished in the region that's modern-day Iraq and Syria, where, needless to say, we're basically just contemplating now the 10th anniversary of the Syrian civil war, which, of course, was partially triggered by drought conditions that forced farm laborers into cities. And it's basically a migrant crisis within Syria that then kind of erupted into a regional and even global conflict, if you consider the rise of ISIS and the way terrorism was exported outside of the borders of this land. So it's relevant for all sorts of reasons. Another reason is that this was a very elaborate society, right? So this is roughly 4,200 years ago. The Akkadian Empire is dated by archaeologists as having basically flourished for about 200 years. It had an elaborate society with a hierarchical structure, the capacity to store grain, developed fairly large cities of several thousands of people, including irrigation methods, dry farming, and things like that. So, and it had, as for example, this mask would testify, some flourishing arts and culture. So these weren't just nomadic hunter-gatherers. These were people who knew how to live within their environment. They had basically become adapted to the semi-arid conditions of the region, and they had figured out ways to grow their food and store their grain for a decent period of time. And so the question is, why did they prosper for 200 years but then collapsed? What could have done it? And so some of the clues towards that, again, if you've already done the reading from Elizabeth Colbert's article, that's part of discussion 3, you already know about it. But in case you don't, one of the key things is to look at oscillations in the climate records that we have. So if you look, for example, at the Greenland ice core, again, this is delta 18, which can loosely be interpreted as temperature for this purpose. And you remember we had basically the last glacial maximum. We had these oscillations we talked about before, the deglaciation and the Bowling Alarod, then the return to near glacial conditions with the Younger Dryas, and then the resumption to the very quiescent climate of the Holocene, or at least so it seems if you look at Greenland, right? So looking in Greenland, you don't see a whole lot happening around 4,200 years ago. But if you look at some, at this particular core right there, so M5422 is a core from the Gulf of Oman. And this is important because basically everything that drained from the rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, the rivers that drain the basin where that sustained the Akkadian Empire, well, basically that sediment eventually makes its way down there and gives you an idea of what climate conditions were upstream of it. So you wouldn't know from looking at the ice in Greenland, but you can certainly learn something about what happened with those rivers, particularly by looking at a downstream sediment core. And so when people look at the sediment core, what they found is that around 4,000 years ago, 4,200 years ago specifically, there's a big change in the chemistry of the sediments. So the mineralogy changes, it's more dolomite. Basically, instead of something that's very poor in calcium carbonate, it becomes very rich in calcium carbonate. And if you look at the timing of the collapse, well, it just seems to coincide with the onset of the trouble. I mean, you know, civilization didn't collapse from one day to the next, but it appears that this is when trouble really started and when basically resettlement began. So, you know, we can look at, you know, how is this related? So again, this seems like it was very relatively unique. Some people have linked these changes to changes in the North Atlantic. Specifically, for example, if you look at the amount of icebergs that are drifting around the North Atlantic, this is what this curve is reconstructing. If you're interested, I can tell you about how geologists reconstruct that. But at the most basic level, think of this curve as indicating warm or cold conditions in the North Atlantic. And it appeared that, you know, it was a relatively warm condition in North Atlantic. And we know from climate modeling that those can sometimes induce a drought over the region. Now, this is clearly not the whole story because there were other such swings during the Holocene that did not seemingly trigger a drought like this. So we don't know everything about why this drought happened and why it was as severe as it was, but it's undeniable that there was a drought. And in fact, this got recorded, and this is another form of climate proxy, if you will. You know, it's when you have civilizations that recorded what happened to them in writing, you have another window, if you will, into the effects of climate change. And so this is from a poem called The Curse of Akkad, which is relatively dramatic, but I want to point out several things here. The gathered clouds did not rain, the masgaram did not grow. So there was a drought, obviously hard hit farmers could not grow their food. Food prices went up, right? That's what they mean. 1 shekel's worth of oil was only 1/2 quart. And this is something that you can still see today, right? When there is a drought and food shortage, prices go up. That's a problem. He who slept on the roof died on the roof. He who slept in the house had no burial. So basically, everyone was affected, right? Even rich merchants who in normal times think of themselves as insulated from these troubles, they also had trouble. So in the words of archaeologist Harry Weiss, the evidence is that a lot of sheep and cattle died of drought. It's estimated that something like 30,000 people abandoned the site, seeking a better fortune elsewhere. So some of the cities shrank in size by 75% and trade collapsed. Now, again, this triggered something like a migrant crisis because um, nomadic herders from the area moved closer to reliable water supplies, bringing them into conflict with farmers. So it is estimated that this affected the whole of the Middle East, included the Egyptian Old Kingdom, basically the end of the Pharaohs dynasty, or one of the first big dynasties. So this was highly significant and clearly related to this drought. So I think it offers several important messages for our civilization, especially in a place like LA or the Southwest in general, where we are indeed in a place that's already semi-arid, and it shows that drought can strike at any point. Right now, the difference, and I'll get to that later, is that these people had no way of foreseeing what was going to happen to them, right? And given their belief system, basically what we think happened is that the social order was predicated, it was sort of a theocracy where the role of the priest was to basically mediate with the gods that everything goes okay. And when clearly everything did not go okay, people rebel and basically overturn the social order. So we may think that that's only relevant to previous civilizations that perhaps did not have the same means of communication that we do today, but it's pretty clear that we still see this kind of thing happening, including during the recent Syrian crisis of the past decade. So by all means, this seems like a warning sign. Okay. So sorry for ruining your Wednesday about this. If you want to read more about this, again, I highly recommend Elizabeth Colbert's article, which goes into a lot more detail about some of this. And yes, there's also a chapter on this in Jared Diamond's book. So that's drought in the Middle East, still relevant today. The next story is about the Greenland Norse. So it's the name that the people we call Vikings they would call themselves the Norse. The reason was that their civilization really originated in Norway. But sometime around the turn of the last millennium, an adventurer called Eric the Red decided to leave Norway. In fact, he was already living in Iceland by the time. So basically, the Vikings had, or the Norse had gone around Northern Europe quite a bit. They were excellent navigators. And it seems like, you can wonder why they decided to go explore. In the case of Eric the Red, it's pretty clear he was not the first son. I think his dad was a warlord of some kind, but he wasn't the first son. So it was clear that he wasn't going to inherit very much. He certainly wasn't going to be a ruler. And so he decided to basically go try his own kingdom somewhere. And so he set sail from Iceland, which had been colonized basically a few hundred years before, I think around 600 AD. And he, actually, no, not that long before. So it was basically the time of expansion of the Norse into the North Atlantic. And they ended up going actually quite a bit around, as you probably know, Columbus was by no means the first European navigator to reach the continent of North America. But very few people in Columbus's time knew about Eric the Red and his voyage. But needless to say, be that as it may, we know that he reached Greenland, and there he helped establish two settlements. So there's the Western settlement on the western flank or western coast of Greenland, and at the southern tip, one somewhat confusingly called Eastern Settlement, which certainly was further east than the Western one, but if it were me, I would have called it the Southern Settlement. In any case, these two settlements had several properties. It's estimated that they held something like 5,000 people at their peak. So if you go there today, this is what you will find, and this is what it looks like on a nice summer day. You still probably need a coat or two because it's still pretty chilly, but it's at least green in the sense that it's not covered with ice, although it is covered with snow much of the year. And indeed, that was a problem for them. The thing is that the Norse came from Norway and they imported their customs and cultural values from them. So one of their very strong cultural values is that they were Christians. So they built a church naturally. And much of what we know about everything that happened comes from these church records. It also appears that they were pretty brisk people, not particularly friendly on first contact, that they were cattle farmers. So they brought cattle with them, including pork, which to them was a sacred meat. Again, a very relative notion, right? If you grew up in the Middle East, pork is to be avoided in most of the cultures there. But if you are a Norse navigator, then pork is basically a fine delicacy and something to be revered. They were also very conservative, and there are good reasons for that. So as people who had lived in pretty marginal environments for a long time, they were unlikely to try many new things. But the problem is when you move to a different place that has a different climate, a different fauna, different flora than where you grew up, being very attached to your ways may not be such a wise thing. So how did they live? Well, a lot of their lifestyle depended on iron and metallurgy. So they were very good at that. The problem is, as you can probably see today, there's not a whole lot of wood in Greenland, and there wasn't back then. So there may have been a few trees which they cut down very quickly, and then they quickly ran out of wood. So they exploited that local environment for everything they could do about it. So they cleared the forest, they established pastures for their cattle, which worked pretty well while climate was warm enough for pastures to be flourishing for a good part of the year, namely the summer. And they hunted local caribou and seals. Pointedly, they did not really venture into seafood. That was something that was not particularly prized by the Norse as a whole, as a culture. And so they did not believe necessary to change their diet, even though seafood was very abundant over there. And they also were highly dependent on trade with the mainland. So what they basically found is that because they couldn't mine iron ore and they didn't have enough sources of heat to forge it, they ended up in this situation where they depended on the mainland, Norway basically, for iron, and that they would trade that in exchange for tusks, ivory basically, that they of course hunted locally. So that gives you an idea of basically how they lived and what their economy was like. Their diplomacy was rather peculiar, if you can count it as diplomacy. So it appears the first recorded encounters, I can't imagine that it went that long without actually meeting the Inuits, but the first recorded encounter happened around 1200 AD. And they described them as wretches, which of course is not a great start to diplomacy. And apparently they decided to stab the ones that they met to see if they bled. So that was their approach to cultural exchange, if you will. Needless to say, they never learned from them. They never thought that the Inuits, who had lived in that region for certainly hundreds of years, probably thousands of years, they did not believe that these people had anything to teach them, particularly in terms of their fishing techniques, their diet, basically how to live in this harsh environment. And so, again, keep that in mind, because this cultural attitude towards problems is one of the most important things here. So what do we know about the climate in Greenland? We have a decent amount of evidence from Greenland itself. Thankfully, we have very good climate proxies from there. And so here you have basically the last 1,000 years in there. And so as we alluded to on Monday, the turn of the millennium was relatively warm. So again, you can see the temperature here is minus 31 degrees Celsius. That I think is from the, it's not where they live because they lived in the coastal areas. This is basically at the top of the glacier. But we're talking about changes on the order of maybe a degree or so, a degree or maybe 2 degrees. So it doesn't sound like very much, but that clearly can be enough for, if you really live at the margin of a glacier like this, that could be enough. So the settlement of the Norse colony starts, right before when this climate record starts. We have evidence that that Inuits moved into northern Greenland in the 12th century. Again, we don't really know why. And then what we know from these church records is that the Western settlement disappears in the mid-14th century. The Eastern settlement survived a little while longer, but in 1408, that's the last recorded marriage in the church that was in the Eastern settlement. And this is the last written document we have from the Greenland Norse. And after that, basically we see that there have been a few cold spells by that point. It's probably not a coincidence that the Western settlement disappeared right around then when, after these big cold spells. And we see that after that, basically Greenland became, the inference is that it became too cold for the Norse to really thrive there. So what's the exact sequence of events? Nobody really knows, because once again, after this last recorded marriage in Valsey, we basically have no archaeological, or we have no written record of what happened. But the story that Jared Diamond sort of puts together is that the colony basically shrank up until the point where what Jared Diamond thinks is that the women in the colony had a choice between basically sticking around with the local leaders, namely the men, because it was a patriarchal society, who clearly could not bring about much prosperity, or they could go with the Inuits, who clearly seemed to know what they were doing with this environment. And so Jared Diamond thinks that that's what happened, and that was the last of the Greenland Norse. Now, perhaps some of them eventually came back to the mainland, but certainly that's the last that the place was inhabited on a year-round basis. Greenland is now under the dominion of the Kingdom of Denmark, and there are some, there is some sort of semi-permanent occupation there, but I believe mostly for scientific purposes, not for farming purposes. So where does that leave us with our 5-point framework? It appears that basically all of the 5 factors that Jared Diamond identified as critical in a civilization survival or collapse, all 5 of these factors were at play here. The Norse did degrade their environment. They cleared the forest to the point of not leaving a single tree standing. Climate was changing. Climate is always changing, but it appeared that it really changed in their disfavor over the time that they were there, specifically in the 13th century or so. There was a decline in friendly contact with Norway. So for other reasons, the appetite from the mainland that they had for these ivory tusks declined. And as a result, it appears that the Greenland Norse became increasingly desperate for iron, which of course they depended on for various things. And so there's evidence that in the later years of the settlements, they became very good at recycling. So they started recycling every little piece of metal that they could and basically repurposing it. And same thing with wood. So there's evidence of pieces of wood that have been worked and reworked many times, suggesting that they would repurpose things that perhaps in ordinary times they would have tossed into the fire. Then there is evidence of hostile contact with Inuits, and it's not entirely surprising when you consider their approach to diplomacy, and especially since apparently the Inuits expanded into northern Greenland. So for whatever reason, the Inuit presence in the Arctic was growing as a whole, and perhaps they saw their chance here to displace the Norse. We will never know exactly what happened, but it's very clear that the Inuits ended up on top of this fight. And lastly, the attitude seems to be the biggest thing, right? As I said, they imported cultural values with them. in a way that made them very resistant to change. And one of the ways in which I think of this all the time when I contemplate, the history of the United States, which in many cases is also a history of basically European conquest of a foreign land and importing some cultural values that may or may not be suited to this land. I think of all the lawns around LA, right? The myth of the English garden is really that. It's from, an English garden is very suitable in England, where the climate is very suitable to have flowers and hedges and lawns and fountains and things like that. Having that in a semi-arid climate like Southern California makes zero sense. Yet, if you walk around LA, you will see plenty of people who are overwatering their lawns and basically keeping it on life support by putting in lots of pesticides and fertilizer for it. And you really have to wonder about the wisdom of this thing. Why do people care so much about having a patch of green grass in front of them? Well, that was a cultural value imported with, I would say, Anglo-Saxon civilization. And, we really have to reconsider these things. What about the cultural values of the, of the migrants should be preserved in the new environment? I think the story of the Greenland Norse clearly shows us that not all cultural attitudes or cultural customs are worth keeping when you move to a new environment. So that's the lesson I derive from this. There's probably others, and I'd be interested to hear your opinion in discussion 3. The last one is about the Anasazi Indian. So Anasazi is a term that is contested. I will say this from the outset. Anasazi is the name in the languages of the Four Corner regions of Mexico that just meant the ancient ones. The descendants of the people that in his book, Jared Diamond called the Anasazi, they prefer to be called the ancient Puebloans. So there was a Pueblo culture, and I'll explain what that means, that basically covered the Four Corner states of Utah, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico, and the Mogollon who reached into basically northern Mexico. And particularly, the most impressive case is the one of Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde. So these are very impressive constructions. Chaco Canyon was the biggest pre-Columbian construction in North America. So prior to the European conquest of North America and the building of, all the large buildings we know today, this was the largest edifice in North America. It is estimated that got settled at about 600 AD. How would we know about this? How would we know the timing of this settlement? If you were an archaeologist and you were trying to date this, how would you go about that? Let me pull up the chat. Carbon-14, yeah, that's one way. Carbon-14 on what? Michael says dating bricks. As it turns out, dating bricks is complicated because when you use isotopic methods, you're basically dating the time that an isotopic system closed. So I don't actually know if it works very well for bricks. You can date human remains and you can date wood, yeah. And wood is really critical here if you want to get a detailed chronology because, of course, wood keeps a trace of its carbon content. So you can analyze fossil wood for its carbon-14 and get a sense of how long ago that tree died. But if you want a more detailed chronology, you can also basically use the tree ring. So you can see that there's all these wooden beams in this thing. And you can get a sense for when these beams were collected and even in some ways trying to reconstruct what the climate was like using this wood. So it's an extremely valuable tool for archaeologists. Another way, perhaps less glamorous, that we know about the sort of the history and the environmental history in particular of this period is through pack rat middens. So pack rats are little rodents that live in these areas, and they basically form these middens, which basically contain some remains of their meals. It's basically, the bulk of this is basically crystallized urine. So it's not very glamorous, but the important thing about this is that these middens keep a trace of whatever these pack rats have eaten, including all the plants and the pollen grains that they ate. And by looking into these middens, we can get an idea of the abundance of various species. So, for example, the ponderosa pine, the common juniper, blue spruce, and so on and so forth. And from that, we can see that from the early Holocene down to the dawn of the Common Era, about 2,000 years ago, there's a progressive shift of the vegetation away from these sort of cold-loving species to these more warm-adapted species. And of course, it's a gradual evolution, right? Plants don't react to climate change like that. It takes them a little while to basically migrate across climate zones. So we know, for example, this is the modern distribution of vegetation, where with, as you know, a lot of this area currently being desert, grasslands, some shrubs and woodlands. And if you look at it 12,000 years ago, a lot of it was more subalpine woodlands or boreal forests even. So these pack rat middens give us an extraordinary window into the changing environmental conditions, particularly the vegetation. And based on that and other sources of evidence, include, of course, the archaeological remain, we have a pretty good idea of what happened to these ancient Puebloans. So we know that the diet of these people was what's often called the three sisters, right? Corns, beans, and a squash. So they had pretty elaborate agriculture. They practiced either dryland or irrigation agriculture. But they were extremely vulnerable to variations in water supply. What Diamond writes is that basically, even though they had the ability to store some of their food, he writes that a drought of more than 3 years would have been fatal, because modern Puebloans can only store corn for 2 or 3 years, after which it becomes too rotten or infested to eat. So there's basically a shelf life on these items. You can't store them indefinitely. And that means that if you go 3 years without being able to grow this food, then you're basically toast. Other thing that happened is that there's evidence that population boomed around, that particular decade, around 1110 AD. And that's significant. So what's the climatic context for these? I mentioned this on the drought lecture, the lecture on the Dust Bowl, but let's go back to this. There's evidence from tree rings from all around North America that there were extensive mega droughts that lasted for several decades on end, including during this particular time, 1130 to 1170 AD. And you can see that these droughts are, drought means below average precipitation. So it doesn't mean it didn't rain at all. You can see these little blue bars there. It means that there's a handful of years that were wetter than average. But by and large, it's very clear that these time periods had below average precipitation. And so you can see that there's some in basically every single one of these centuries. So it seems that there's a recurring pattern of these medieval droughts. Now, the difference with something like the Dust Bowl is that these weren't necessarily drier conditions in terms of it still rained, perhaps as much as it did rain this winter, for instance. So it rained a bit this winter. It just rained a lot less than it was supposed to, right? And the trouble is when these conditions persist for years on end, or even decades, as in the case of this drought, for instance, that's what makes it a mega drought, okay? So the difference between a drought and a mega drought is not the severity as much as the duration. So we can reconstruct the percentage of the American West that was griped by drought conditions. And this is what this curve shows you. So it shows you that there's a long-term average of around, I don't know, 35 or 40%, meaning that, yes, we do live in a dry climate. And that means that on any given year, about 40% of the American West is in drought conditions. That is to be expected. But there are some fairly significant fluctuations around that. So in particular, when you look at that drought centered around 1150, you see that for several decades, we went into above 50% territory. There, of course, are also these pluvials. So the blue arrows here denote we call pluvials, periods that were wetter than average. But you can see that none of them happened during these medieval times, much to the ancient Puebloans' sorrow. So what do we know about the timeline of these Puebloans? Well, based on the provenance of the trees and the Pacrac middens, we can document abandoned deforestation for construction purposes. So Chaco Canyon in particular was clearly a power center, political and religious power. It had several thousand people living in it at some point. But then basically the population got too big to sustain environmental pressures. And that's always a lesson here, is that you can, a small band of either hunter-gatherers or farmers can figure out a balance even in a marginal environment for some time. But if the population grows too much, then it may exceed that balance, and that may become an issue. So on the heels of that population growth, which happened, basically fairly steadily, but particularly in the 1100s or so, a very severe drought struck. That one from 1130 to 1170. So it's not to say that the previous droughts had no impact, but clearly the civilization had the means to deal with it, or it was small enough that it didn't induce mass starvation. The problem is with the conjunction of a growing population and a very extended drought. Basically, this is when the last beam was laid out in Chaco Canyon. So this is how we know that the site basically was abandoned. Warfare begins with a backdrop of starvation. And so there's evidence that people started eating basically whatever they could, which including small game, rats, and eventually there is evidence that of cannibalism. Now, that's not particularly pleasant to think about, but we also know of modern examples of, people who crashed in an airplane crash in the middle of nowhere. And it doesn't take very long before people start eating each other, unfortunately. Starvation will lead people to do very desperate things. And so I don't think we should use this as a way to judge another culture. I think it just reveals more about human nature in general, that when people are hungry, they will go to any length, including overturning power structures and so on. So the canyon got abandoned sometime in the late 12th century, and it's still unoccupied today. Now, as I said, the Anasazi, the ancient ones, still live on to this day in the Pueblo cultures that still survive to this day, just not in these numbers in those areas, right? So people basically found a new equilibrium with their environment, but that included not such a big concentration of people. So what are the key points for the Anasazi collapse? It was a stable and advanced society, and yet catastrophic collapse happened to them. The trigger seems to have been medieval megadroughts, and that's even in spite of rather elaborate irrigation systems. Now, it's important to realize that the American West was settled at a relatively wet time. And maybe I should go back to this, right? Much of the American West and particularly California was really settled in the 1800s, and much of water planning and the building of dams and so on happened in this early part of the 20th century, which was, by all accounts, one of the wettest in the past millennium. And you can see the problem with this is that if you only have knowledge of this yellow rectangle, basically, you think that life is going to be awesome all the time. Until you discover that no, actually life wasn't so awesome all the time, and that the climate system is capable of these long extended droughts, which can really doom your civilization. So let me go back to this. Those are the key points basically for the Anasazi. And in the interest of time, there is a summary slide that I'll post online, but let's move on to our poll for the day. So let me stop sharing for a second. Thank you, Theo, for posting the link. You beat me to it. So let's go and poll everywhere. And let's see. How do I present? I think I'm going to have to do it like this. Okay. Yes, I need to deactivate the previous one. Hopefully you all had a chance to do it. And I'm going to activate this one. Let's see. So if you go to poll everywhere, are you able to see? Yeah, I see 20 results. So let me share my screen. So we're all on the same page. Hopefully you do see it on your screen as well. So the question is, which of the following factors always plays a significant role in civilizational collapse? And the operating word here is always. So is it A, environmental damage, B, climate change, C, hostile neighbors, D, the loss of friendly trade partners, or E, the societal attitude towards change? So let me give you another minute or so. We've got 59 responses, 60. Thought we had more people than that, but maybe that's all we'll get. 64, not bad. Okay, so if you're still in the process of logging in, let's try to wrap this up quickly because we're coming to the end of the class. So I'm going to log this, 65, excellent. And so the correct answer, of course, is the societal attitude towards change. That's what's always significant. Climate change mattered in the cases that I showed today, but not in all civilization collapse. So we should not belabor that point. It's not always climate change, even though it does matter sometimes. Let's see, how do I get to the next one? I'm going to deactivate this one and activate this one. It is not letting me do this. Okay, well, I guess it's the end of our time. So we'll call it a day for this, and I'll post the other question as a survey, including for people who are attending this asynchronously. So thank you very much for your attention, and I will see you guys on Friday.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Professor.